My own son booked me a hotel room so his in-laws could feel comfortable. But he didn't know the paperwork in my name had already been signed. Tell me where you're listening from, and if you've ever been pushed aside by your own family, comment, I relate. Have you ever been pushed out of a room by the people who should have protected you, and you still had to smile like it didn't hurt? Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe because the twist that comes next is the kind people don't see coming until it's too late. My name is Diane Harper, and I learned something brutal at my son's dinner. You can give someone your whole life and still be treated like an inconvenience when the right people are watching. The venue was one of those places where everything is soft and expensive on purpose. Warm lighting, quiet strings in the background, servers who glide instead of walk, and tables set like a magazine shoot. It was meant to celebrate my son Ethan and his wife Lauren, but it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a performance, and I could tell Ethan had been rehearsing his role all day. He barely looked at me when I arrived. He hugged me with one arm, like he was worried someone would see it, then immediately turned to greet Victor and Celeste Langford, Lauren's parents, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Victor had that polished look people wear when they're used to being obeyed. Celeste looked me up and down the way you scan a price tag, and then she smiled as if she'd decided I wasn't worth much. Lauren tried, I'll give her that. She squeezed my hand when no one was watching, like she was apologizing without saying the words. But every time she opened her mouth to include me, Celeste would cut in with a question for someone more important, and Ethan would follow the redirect like he'd been trained. I sat where they placed me. Not at the center, not near Ethan and Lauren, but off to the side with relatives I didn't know well and a couple of friends of the family who kept glancing over like they were trying to figure out what I'd done wrong to earn that seat. I kept my posture straight and my smile steady, the same way I used to when I was working double shifts and didn't want Ethan to see I was tired. Then came the small humiliations, the kind that look harmless until you add them up. Celeste forgot my name twice. Victor spoke about family legacy like it was a club I hadn't paid to enter. A server asked if I wanted wine, and Celeste answered for me without even turning her head, as if I wasn't there. Ethan laughed along too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, the laugh of a man trying to prove he belongs. I told myself to get through the evening, just get through it, let your son have his moment, don't become a problem. That's when Ethan leaned down beside my chair, close enough that his voice wouldn't carry, and said it like he was doing me a favor. Mum, I booked you a room at the Westbridge Hotel, just for tonight. I blinked at him, not understanding. The Westbridge was across town, a luxury place people use when they're trying to impress someone. He kept going, quick and rehearsed. Victor and Celeste, they're not comfortable. They want the family part to be smaller. It's just easier this way. You can rest. I'll have the driver take you. I stared at him like he'd spoken another language. I waited for the part where he winked and said he was joking. It didn't come. I could feel the heat rising up my neck, that mix of shock and shame that makes your skin feel too tight. Around us, the table chatter kept flowing, cutlery clinking, laughter rising and falling, the entire room pretending it didn't notice the moment my son decided I didn't fit his picture. Ethan, I said softly, because I still didn't want to cause a scene. Are you serious? His jaw tensed. He didn't look at me, not really. Please don't make this hard. That was the part that landed. Not the hotel, not the distance, not even the insult. The fact he expected me to cooperate with my own erasure so his evening could stay smooth. A man in a dark suit appeared behind him. Security, or a driver, or both. Ethan stood up like the conversation was done, like my feelings were an item he'd checked off his list. I rose slowly. My hands were steady, but only because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me shake. I picked up my purse, adjusted my coat, and smiled once at Lauren. Her eyes were glossy, but she didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there like a person trapped between two storms, praying neither one would hit her. As I walked away, I heard Celeste's laugh. Light, pleased, victorious, like the room had finally been corrected. Outside, the night air felt sharper than it should have. The car waiting at the curb was black and spotless, the kind of sedan that makes you sit up straighter even when you don't want to. The driver opened the door without a word. I slid into the back seat, and the leather was cold under my palms. The door shut, the lock clicked. And for the first time that night, the silence hit me hard enough to steal my breath. Through the tinted glass, I could still see the glow from the venue's entrance. People moving, laughing, living. My son's world continuing like I hadn't mattered at all. I pressed my fingers against the window, not to bang on it, not to beg, but because I needed something solid to hold on to. My throat burned. My eyes stung. 10 years of swallowing things rose up at once, and I hated myself for still wanting to protect him even now. Then, in the front seat, the driver turned the engine off. The cabin went still. And the driver, an older man I hadn't noticed properly before, turned just enough for his voice to reach me clearly. "Mrs. Harper," he said, calm and firm, "please don't cry. Your paperwork finalized this morning." I froze. My heart didn't race. It stopped for half a beat, like my body was waiting to confirm what it just heard. He lifted a tablet from the center console, angled it toward me, and added the sentence that snapped the entire night into a different shape. "This car, this security detail, and the Harper Langford Group are now under your authority. I'm awaiting your instructions." I stared at the screen, at the official layout, at my own name where I did not expect to see it. And while my son toasted strangers inside that warm ballroom, I took one slow breath in the dark of the back seat and realized something simple. They didn't send me away to punish me. They sent me away because they thought I was powerless. The driver met my eyes in the mirror. "What would you like to do next?" he asked, "about your son." On the drive to the hotel, my mind kept replaying Ethan's face when he told me to leave. Not angry, not even cruel, just empty in that modern way people get when they've decided your feelings are an acceptable casualty. The tablet sat on my lap like it weighed 100 pounds, and with every streetlight that slid across the tinted windows, the truth became clearer. This wasn't a sudden decision at dinner, it was a plan that had been arranged long before I walked into that venue. The driver introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell, and he spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd been waiting for permission to finally say what he knew. He didn't oversell it, didn't try to comfort me, just explained that my late husband's shares had been held in trust until certain conditions were met, and one of those conditions had been triggered that morning. I didn't interrupt him, partly because I didn't want to show how shaken I was, and partly because I was piecing together how Ethan could look me in the eye, call me Mum, and still treat me like baggage to be stored somewhere else for the night. I asked the question that mattered, the one that felt like swallowing glass. Ethan knew, didn't he? Mr. Caldwell didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Then he said Ethan had been told there were arrangements in place, but not the details, and that Victor Langford had been confident the details would never land in my hands at the wrong moment. The way he said "wrong moment" told me everything about the kind of people I was dealing with. The sort who think timing is a weapon and truth is something you release only when it benefits you. When we reached the hotel, the valet team rushed out like we were royalty. Mr. Caldwell didn't open the door right away. He asked if I wanted to go inside or if I wanted to understand the full picture first. I told him to keep talking because the shock had worn off and something colder had taken its place, something steady. He swiped through documents on the tablet, corporate registry records, board resolutions, the kind of paperwork that looks boring until you realize it can change a life faster than a screaming match ever could. He explained that Victor Langford wasn't just my son's in-law, he'd been steering Ethan for months, pushing him into decisions, into appearances, into a version of marriage where Lauren was a bridge and Ethan was the toll. And the final insult, the reason they were so comfortable sending me away, was that they believed I was the last obstacle to closing whatever deal they'd been building behind smiles and speeches. Ethan wasn't protecting his marriage that night, he was protecting their plan. Standing under the hotel canopy lights, with the lobby's golden marble glow behind me, I watched my own breath fog in the cold air and realized how quickly humiliation turns into clarity when you finally see the motives. It wasn't personal to them. That was the worst part. I wasn't hated because of who I was. I was dismissed because of what I represented. A reminder that Ethan came from somewhere they didn't control and a person who might ask questions when they needed obedience. Mr. Caldwell finally opened the door and stepped aside, not like an employee, but like someone acknowledging an authority he'd been waiting to recognize. I walked into the lobby without trembling, past the chandelier that looked like it had been designed to intimidate, and I didn't stop at the reception desk. I went straight to the quiet seating area, sat down, and told him to show me everything, because if I was going to walk back into that venue, I was going to do it with facts, not feelings. The more I read, the more the hour before the dinner made sense. Ethan's sudden insistence that I wear something simple. Lauren's nervous glances at her mother. Victor's pointed comments about clean optics and fresh starts. Even the seating arrangement wasn't a mistake, it was a message, and the hotel room wasn't kindness, it was exile with a bow on it. I asked Mr. Caldwell one more question, the one that made his eyes harden. If I return tonight, will they try to remove me again? He said yes, and he added that security follows ownership, not ego, and the men outside the venue would take their cues from whoever signs their paychecks, not whoever shouts the loudest. I stood up, smoothed the front of my coat, and felt my pulse settle into something calm and dangerous. The hotel room key card was offered to me like a consolation prize. I didn't take it. I handed the tablet back to Mr. Caldwell and told him to bring the car around. Because I didn't need a bed. I needed an hour. And I was going to spend it walking back into that room where they'd made me small, while they still believed I was the one being sent away. The car stopped under the venue's canopy like nothing had happened, like I hadn't been erased an hour ago. From the outside, the ballroom still glowed with laughter and music, the kind of warm light people mistake for happiness. I stepped out slowly, not because I was scared, but because I wanted every second to belong to me. Mr. Caldwell stayed a pace behind, close enough to be support, far enough to let it be clear I wasn't being escorted. I was returning. At the entrance, the same two security guards who had shoved me into the car shifted the moment they saw me. One of them lifted a hand automatically, then stopped mid-motion, like his body remembered the order but his brain realized the room had changed. He glanced toward his earpiece, waiting for instruction that didn't come from Marcus or my son or anyone at the head table. Mr. Caldwell said nothing. He didn't need to. The guard's posture softened into something that looked like respect, and he stepped aside. Inside, the noise hit me first. Glasses clinking, chairs scraping, a burst of laughter that rose and fell like waves. People weren't laughing because they were cruel. They were laughing because the room had decided I was the acceptable joke, and that decision made them feel safe. I moved through the crowd without rushing, past couples who didn't look at me twice, past women in gowns who glanced at my dress like it was a stain. I kept my face neutral, but my eyes were sharp, taking in who mattered and who didn't. Near the bar, I caught sight of my son. He stood with his shoulders squared, smiling too hard, surrounded by Victor's circle, the kind of men who clap you on the back while measuring how useful you are. Ethan's smile faltered when he saw me. It wasn't fear yet. It was confusion, the panicked kind, like a man seeing a door he thought he'd locked standing open. Lauren saw me next. Her hand went to her throat, fingers tightening around a necklace that looked expensive and heavy. She leaned toward her mother, whispering something urgent. Victor turned slowly, and the moment his eyes landed on me, his face tightened just enough to show the calculation underneath the charm. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked annoyed that the timing had changed. I didn't go to them, not yet. I walked straight to the staff side first, to the edge of the room where waiters moved like shadows and managers watched for trouble. A tired-looking banquet supervisor stepped forward, ready to block me the way venues block problems. I met his gaze and said my name calmly, the way someone says a password. Mr. Caldwell handed him a small card and a folded letter. The supervisor read one line, then his face changed. Not flattery, not friendliness. Compliance. He nodded once and turned toward the stage. The microphone was between speeches, resting on its stand like a loaded weapon nobody had noticed. I watched the people closest to the stage. They were still smiling, still floating on champagne and confidence, still unaware that the room could flip in a single minute. It's strange how power works. Most of the time it isn't taken. It's granted. The room gives it to whoever looks like they deserve it. I was about to teach them what deserving actually looks like. As I stepped toward the stage, someone tried to intercept me. Victor's assistant, a woman with a tight bun and a clipboard, the kind of person who missed. Aches proximity for authority. She smiled without warmth and angled her body to block my path, murmuring that the program was set and that family matters could be handled privately. I didn't argue. I simply kept walking. She moved again, sharper this time, reaching for my wrist. A security guard appeared at her shoulder immediately, not mine. He spoke quietly to her, and she froze, then backed away as if she'd touched something hot. Her eyes flicked to Victor, then to Mr. Caldwell, and the truth landed in her face like a slap. She was suddenly very small. By the time I reached the steps, the music had thinned. People sensed a shift the way animals sense weather. Conversations softened. Heads turned. The bride's family watched like it was entertainment returning for an encore. My son's face had gone stiff, the color draining from it in patches. He started walking toward me, quick at first, then slower, like he didn't know whether to stop me or plead. I climbed the steps and stood at the microphone. The lights were warm and flattering, designed to make everyone look like they belonged. I wrapped my fingers around the mic and felt the quiet spread across the ballroom, table by table, until the room held its breath. Ethan stopped halfway between his table and the stage. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Victor lifted his chin, trying to project calm. His wife's smile was already cracking. I looked out over the crowd, over the faces that had watched me be pushed out, over the phones that had risen to record my humiliation, over the people who only respect what they fear losing. My voice didn't shake when I spoke, because I wasn't there to beg for dignity. I was there to collect it. And when I began, I made sure the first words were simple, clear, and impossible to laugh off. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Silence does more damage in a room like that because it forces people to hear you whether they want to or not. I looked straight ahead, not at Victor, not at Lauren, not even at my son. I looked at the crowd, the witnesses, the ones who had decided my humiliation was harmless entertainment. "My name is Serena," I said, steady, "and I think we should clear something up before anyone makes another decision for me tonight." A few nervous laughs fluttered and died quickly. The kind of laugh people use to test whether it's still safe to be cruel. It was. I could feel it in the way shoulders tightened and hands paused mid-sip. I reached down, and Mr. Caldwell stepped closer without entering the spotlight. He placed a slim folder on the edge of the podium like it belonged there. It wasn't thick, it wasn't dramatic. It was neat, official, the kind of thing people fear because it doesn't care who your friends are. "I was told to wait in the car," I continued, letting the words hang for half a beat. "So I did, and while I was there, I learned something my husband forgot to mention." My son flinched at the word husband. Victor's eyes narrowed, trying to predict the angle of the knife before it landed. "This evening, I'm also told I'm an embarrassment," I said, calm as glass. "That I don't fit, that I should stay quiet so I don't ruin anyone's image." I opened the folder slowly, not for theatrics, but because the room was watching my hands like they were holding a match over gasoline. "The company funding this life everyone is enjoying tonight," I said, "is not owned by Marcus." That was the moment the room truly changed, not with noise, but with a physical shift. People leaned forward. People stopped breathing. Even the staff along the walls froze, pretending they weren't listening while listening hardest of all. Marcus took one step forward, jaw tight, ready to cut me off with charm or rage, whichever worked faster. But the head of security, the same man who had moved without question earlier, angled his body into Marcus's path like a silent wall. It wasn't aggressive. It was final. Marcus saw it and went still. I kept my gaze on the page in front of me, as if this was a board meeting, not a ballroom. "According to the registry and the trust transfer filed today," I said, "Thorne Group is owned by Serena B. Hawthorne." The name hit the air like a slap, not because it was shocking, but because it was clean, unarguable, a fact, the kind of fact that doesn't care if you're popular. A woman near the front lifted her phone higher, hands trembling with excitement. Someone whispered, "Is this real?" Someone else whispered, "Her father." And then the whispers multiplied, crawling across the room like a fire looking for oxygen. Marcus laughed, sharp and forced, like a man trying to breathe through a closing throat. He lifted his hands in a friendly gesture that didn't match his eyes. "Everyone, please," he said loudly, aiming his voice at the crowd. "My wife is upset. She's confused. This is family business, nothing more." I looked at him for the first time. I didn't glare, I didn't plead. I simply held. His gaze long enough for people to notice what I noticed. the panic under the polish, the desperation under the suit. Confused, I repeated softly into the microphone, "No." I slid a second page out of the folder and held it up just enough for the front row to see the stamp, the date, the signature lines. "This is the contract Marcus signed," I said. 10 years, management rights only, no ownership, expired at midnight. Marcus's face drained so fast it was almost frightening. His mouth opened again, and this time his voice came out jagged. "That's stolen," he snapped. "That's private." I nodded once, as if he'd confirmed my point. "It was in company files," I said evenly, "which means it was never private, it was mine." The room was no longer a party. It was a courtroom with chandeliers. I turned one more page, and my voice stayed calm, but the words sharpened. "And this," I said, "is the invoice for tonight's event." I paused just long enough. "Paid from company accounts." A murmur rolled through the crowd, louder now, uglier. In that world, humiliation can be forgiven. Debt cannot. A man can cheat and still get invited back. A man who doesn't pay people quietly becomes poison. Marcus lunged toward the stage again, anger overpowering calculation, but he stopped short when the security detail shifted as one, not toward me, but toward him. Their loyalty had moved, and Marcus could feel it. I didn't have to insult him. The room was doing it with their eyes. I lowered my gaze to the staff lined along the wall, the servers who had been invisible all night the way I had been. "If any member of staff has not been paid," I said, "that ends tonight." Mr. Caldwell stepped forward then, still not in focus, and handed a thick envelope to the banquet supervisor. The man stared at it like it was a lifeline. He nodded, tight and grateful, and moved quickly toward the back. The symbolism landed hard. I wasn't just claiming power. I was correcting the kind of power Marcus used, loud, cruel, wasteful. I looked back at the crowd. "The event is over," I said simply. "Please leave." For a second, nobody moved, like the room needed permission to obey someone new. Then chairs scraped, people stood, conversations sparked in frantic bursts. Couples began drifting toward the exits, not wanting to be the last one seen near Marcus when the story hit the morning news. Marcus stayed frozen in the center aisle, eyes wide, watching his kingdom evacuate itself. And my son, Ethan, finally reached the edge of the stage, his face caught between anger and fear and something like regret. He looked up at me as if he didn't know who I was anymore. And I realized the next part wouldn't be public. It would be personal. The moment the ballroom started emptying, everything got louder without a single person raising their voice. Chairs scraped, heels clicked, and the polite smiles people wore all night collapsed into hurried exits and whispered judgments. The in-laws, table stayed seated the longest, not out of dignity, but because they were calculating how to get out without looking like they were running. Marcus stood in the middle of it all like he'd been unplugged, staring at faces that used to light up for him, now sliding away as if he carried a smell. I stepped down from the stage without any rush. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. Like someone had finally wiped the fog off a mirror and I could see the room for what it really was. Mr. Caldwell moved with me, close enough to be there, far enough to let me breathe. The security detail didn't look at me like a problem anymore. They looked at me like instructions. My son found me near the edge of the dance floor, in that awkward space where people pretend they're not watching while watching harder than ever. Ethan didn't touch my arm like he used to when he wanted to steer me. He hovered, uncertain, as if he finally understood that I wasn't something he could place somewhere and forget. His face was tight, not with guilt, but with panic that his life had shifted in a direction he didn't control. "Why would you do this?" he asked, voice low, like he was still trying to keep the family image intact even after it had already cracked. He wasn't asking what was true. He was asking why I had said it out loud. I looked at him and realized how carefully he'd been trained. Not by me, by them. How to be present without being loyal. How to stand beside me without standing up for me. How to call me Mum in private and act like I was an inconvenience in public. I didn't answer immediately, because I wanted to be sure he heard the part that mattered. "Because you sent me to a hotel," I said quietly, "at your own wedding events, like I was something you had to hide." His jaw clenched. He tried to glance around, checking who could hear, still managing optics even now. You're making it sound worse than it was, he muttered, as if wording could soften the act. I held his gaze. It was exactly what it was. That's when Lauren appeared, moving fast, eyes bright with fury that didn't match her position anymore. She didn't look at me like a person. She looked at me like an obstacle that had suddenly learned how to speak. Behind her, Victor and Patricia were closing in, not together, but as a unit that knew how to surround. Lauren's voice was sharp. You just destroyed my family's name in one night. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. They always talk about names when they mean money. They always talk about respect when they mean control. Your family's name will survive, I said. It usually does. What you're upset about is the money attached to it. Victor stepped forward, forcing calm into his expression like a man who'd practiced it in mirrors. Serena, he said, like we were having a reasonable chat. This doesn't need to be messy. We can fix this quietly. That word, quietly, landed like a threat wrapped in manners. Quietly meant behind doors. Quietly meant back to the old version of me. Quietly meant they got to keep what they were taking. Ethan shifted beside me, and I watched him make the choice before he spoke. His shoulders angled slightly toward them, not me. His eyes flicked to Marcus, checking the damage, checking which side had the better chance of staying powerful by morning. Mum, he said, and even that word sounded like a negotiation. Just stop. You've made your point. Let's go home. Home, the house I had paid for and been treated like a guest inside. The home where decisions happened without me and plans were made around me. The home where my husband's voice mattered more than my breath. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood. This was the line. The moment where my son either stepped toward me or away from me, and he had already stepped. You're not asking me to stop, I said softly. You're asking me to shrink. His eyes flashed, offended, as if I'd accused him unfairly. I'm asking you to be reasonable. Reasonable. Another word people use when they want you to accept disrespect without making it inconvenient. Patricia's voice cut in, sweet and poisonous. You've always been unstable, Serena. We tried to be patient with you. I looked at her, and I saw the entire pattern in one clear picture. The jokes, the little humiliations, the way they measured my worth by how quietly I swallowed it, the way my son learned to laugh along so he wouldn't be the next target. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'm leaving, I said to Ethan, but not because you told me to. I'm leaving because this is no longer my room. Ethan's face hardened. So you're choosing this over your son? The question was designed to wound because it assumed he was the only thing that mattered. It assumed motherhood meant surrender. It assumed love meant obedience. I exhaled slowly. No, I said, you chose first. The words landed and stayed there. Ethan blinked like he hadn't expected me to say it. Like he thought I would always soften, always apologize, always fold myself smaller so he could feel bigger. Behind us, Marcus finally moved, charging forward with a last burst of desperation, shouting my name like it was a leash. The security team stepped in again and stopped him without touching him, just blocking the path, making him feel what it was like to be powerless in public. I didn't look back at him. I walked toward the exit, and the hallway swallowed the noise like a curtain. The warmth of the ballroom fell away, and the air turned cooler, cleaner. Mr. Caldwell matched my pace without speaking. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was steady. And as I reached the doors, I heard Ethan call out again, sharper this time, as if he could still pull me back with the right tone. Mum, if you walk out now, don't come back. I paused for half a second, not because I was tempted, but because I wanted him to remember what he said. People forget their cruelty when it's convenient. I wasn't going to let him. I turned my head just enough for him to see my face. I won't, I said. Then I stepped into the night, and the moment the doors closed behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Because now the next move wasn't about proving anything in a ballroom. It was about deciding what kind of life I was going to build once the dust settled. The next morning, the hotel's blackout curtains couldn't keep the truth out. My phone buzzed before sunrise, not with an apology but with panic. Orion's voice came through tight and strained, like he was trying to speak without his pride cracking. He asked where I was, not how I was, not if I slept, just where. I told him calmly I was still at the hotel he sent me to, the one he thought would cool things down, as if a mother's dignity was a kettle you could move off the stove. There was a long pause, then a sound behind him, a muffled argument, someone else breathing too close to the phone. I could already picture it. A kitchen full of expensive silence, his in-laws standing over him, and my son trying to hold the roof up with his bare hands. By the time I reached the lobby, the hotel staff was treating me differently. Not because they suddenly liked me, but because people like that only understand authority when it's stamped, signed, and undeniable. The night manager approached with the kind of polite stiffness that means a legal email arrived while he was still half asleep. He didn't call me ma'am like a favor anymore. He called me Mrs. Washington like a decision had been made. He offered breakfast. He offered a car. He offered privacy. I took none of it. I took my time instead, because the thing about being pushed aside for years is you learn patience. And when the tables finally turn, you don't rush. You let it land. Outside, a black SUV waited, not because Orion sent it, but because the right people did. The driver opened the door and didn't ask where we were going. He asked what I wanted. That's the difference between being tolerated and being respected. I said the venue, not the family's house, not their church. The venue, the place where they'd performed their little social play and tried to cut me out of the cast. If they wanted to make me small in public, then the correction would also be public. When I walked back into that ballroom, last night's glitter looked tired. The flowers were wilting. The leftover champagne smelled sour. The same people who laughed when I was sent away were suddenly careful about where they placed their eyes. Orion stood near the head table, collar unbuttoned, face pale, hands doing that useless twitch men get when their control slips. His wife stood beside him, mascara smudged like she'd slept in tears. And her parents, those proud, polished people who treated me like an inconvenience, looked like they'd been awake all night rehearsing fear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need a microphone. The room quieted anyway, because panic is loud even when no one is speaking. Orion tried to step toward me, like he could block the moment with his body, and I watched him realize something in real time. A son can stand between a storm and a door, but he can't stop the weather. His mother-in-law moved first, forcing a smile so tight it looked painful. She started with the usual lines, the fake respect, the misunderstanding, the "we didn't mean it like that." Then her husband tried to sound firm, but his words fell apart halfway through, because men who live off status rarely know what to do when it stops working. Then the truth came out the way it always does, not like a confession, but like a leak. The venue hadn't been paid. The vendors were calling. The deposits were disputed. A legal notice had landed at dawn, and the family name that looked so shiny on invitations now looked ugly on paperwork. Their perfect celebration was sitting on top of a mess of unpaid invoices and borrowed pride. And Orion, my Orion, had signed his name under it, because that's what he'd been doing for months, signing his name under other people's expectations and calling it love. His father-in-law finally said it out loud, not because he wanted to, but because the room had squeezed him into honesty. He admitted they'd demanded Orion handle me because I didn't fit their image. He admitted they'd insisted I be removed like an old chair that didn't match the Dacre. He admitted they'd threatened to ruin Orion's career connections if he didn't control his mother. Orion's wife flinched at that, like she'd heard the words before but never realized how cruel they sounded when spoken in daylight. That's when she turned on him, not on her parents, on Orion, because it's easier to blame the man you married than the people who raised you. Her voice rose, sharp and shaking, asking him how he could do that to me, how he could send his own mother away. Orion tried to defend himself, tried to explain it was one night, tried to say it was for peace, but none of it sounded like a husband anymore. It sounded like a boy begging permission. Her father stepped in, furious now, saying Orion embarrassed them, saying he was weak, saying he couldn't manage his own household. And right there, in the middle of their argument, the divorce word slipped out. First as a threat, then as a solution, then as a demand. Her mother said it with a trembling mouth, as if she couldn't believe she had to lower herself to it. Her father said it like an order. And Orion's wife, in a voice that didn't sound like love or hate but pure survival, said she couldn't stay married to a man who couldn't protect her image. That was the moment I saw it clearly. They didn't want a marriage. They wanted a shield. The begging came fast after that, not from my daughter-in-law, from her parents. They approached me like they were approaching a judge, asking me to talk sense into Orion, asking me to help smooth this, asking me to remem. Burr family? Funny how people discover family the second they need saving. I looked at them and felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage, not joy, just a clean emptiness. Because once you see the shape of someone's character, you can't unsee it. Orion finally met my eyes, really met them. His face broke in a way I'll never forget. He whispered "Mama" like he used to when he was small and scared. For a second, I saw the child I raised, the one who used to run to me when the world got loud. Then he swallowed and tried to become the man he'd been pretending to be. He asked me what he should do. I didn't tell him to fight for his marriage. I didn't tell him to beg her to stay. I didn't even tell him to divorce. I told him the truth he'd been avoiding for years. If you build your life around pleasing people who don't respect you, you will lose the people who actually love you. I told him that sending me away wasn't the worst thing he did. The worst thing was choosing silence every time someone tried to make me less. I told him I wasn't there to rescue him from consequences. I was there so he could finally face them with his eyes open. His wife's father demanded again that the divorce happen immediately, as if speed could erase embarrassment. Orion's wife stared at her ring like it had turned into a trap. The guests around us looked away, suddenly very interested in napkins and water glasses, because rich rooms love drama as long as it isn't theirs. And then, like a final insult dressed as dignity, her mother said they would let Orion go if he signed quietly. Orion didn't shout. He didn't perform. He just nodded once like he'd aged 10 years in one breath. And that was the hour later. That was the begging. Not for love, not for healing. For a divorce so they could cut the story away and pretend it never belonged to them. When the papers were requested, I turned and walked out before anyone could ask me for another favor. My son followed me into the hallway, voice cracking now, asking if I hated him. I told him hate takes too much energy. I told him I was hurt, and I was disappointed, and I was done being treated like a problem. Then I told him the part that mattered most. I would always be his mother, but I would never again be his excuse. He stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes wet, and for the first time in a long time, he looked like someone who might actually change. Not because he lost a marriage, but because he finally understood what it cost to trade respect for approval. I left him there with that lesson, because some lessons don't need shouting. They just need space to echo. And when I stepped outside into the daylight, I felt lighter. Not because my son's life was falling apart, but because my silence was over. He sent me to a hotel to keep me out of sight. 1 hour later, they begged for a divorce to keep themselves clean. The difference is, I didn't need to beg for anything. I just needed to remember who I was.